right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for a discussion on annual planning. My name is Danielle Brummer, and I'm the Chief Growth Officer at Lean Techniques. For those of you unfamiliar with us, Lean Techniques is a technology and management consultancy based in the Midwest, and we focus on helping organizations turn technology into their competitive advantage. As we all know, Q4 can be one of the most high-pressure times of the year. On one hand, you're working to wrap up this year's priorities, and on the other, you're tasked with setting the direction for the year ahead. It's a tricky balancing act in any type of environment, but especially in a very dynamic and uncertain one. Today's conversation is all about addressing those challenges and offering up some ideas and potential solutions to consider and hopefully leverage in the weeks and months ahead. At Lean Techniques, we work closely with leaders and teams facing these types of challenges every day. Our panel for the day is made up of our current LT consultants who have been in your shoes, tasked with setting the course for the year within both large enterprises and mid-sized companies. As always, I have a couple housekeeping items, and then I promise I'll hand it over to the pros. We'd really love for this session to be interactive. Please use the Q&A feature to submit questions, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can throughout the discussion. We'll also have a few polls throughout today's session to better understand your unique vantage point. We'll go ahead and kick those off right now. With this first poll, we'd love to get a sense of where you are in the planning process and what you're hoping to gain from today's session. We'll bring up the poll during introductions, and if you'd like to respond, it'll help us tailor our conversation a bit more to your needs. All right, we're set. Let's get started. Let's start today by having each panelist just give a brief introduction of themselves and their background. Jim, I'll get started with you.
Okay. Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Lowry. I consult here at LT in the areas of strategy and leadership and technology. Probably one of the elder statesmen here at LT, if not the elder statesman here at the organization, as I've been in technology now for over 3 decades. And my experience in annual planning has actually been involved on kind of the both ends of the spectrum, really. I've been involved in the creation of annual plans. I've been involved in kind of being the recipient of annual plans. And then I've had the opportunity more recently to be the facilitator of groups that are conducting and creating annual plans. So anxious to compare and contrast my experience with those of you in the audience today.
All right, Mike,
Mike,
go ahead.
Over to you.
Yep, good morning. My name is Mike Dowsman. I am also a technology and management consultant with Lean Techniques. I think I give Jim a run for his money because my career also has spanned over 3 decades. And with a handful of Fortune 500 companies. In a recent former life, I was the director of professional services. And my capacity with annual planning, like Jim's, has been kind of all aspects of it. So I've submitted the plans. I have fought with finance and HR and our senior leaders on the plans, and then executed them. So looking forward to kind of collaborating with everybody today. Scott?
Hey, I'm Scott Sauber. I'm the Director of Engineering here at Lean Techniques. So I kind of float around and do a lot of different things. And part of what I'm doing around this time is doing a lot of advising at a lot of different clients of, the strategic planning time of year and kind of where to invest, like where the industry is going, all of those kinds of things. And so, yeah, that's some of the experience I bring. And I don't like talking about myself, so I want to kick it over to Danielle to kick off this conversation.
All right. Well, thanks all. I appreciate the introductions. We'll go ahead and get started handing it back over to Jim. I'd really like to have you just get all of us on an even playing field around the topic of annual planning. Fundamentally, what is the purpose of strategic planning, and why do organizations spend so much time on this?
Yeah, it's probably a really good place to start the conversation today. So, I think a lot of things can get wrapped up in annual planning, and you can club a lot of parts into it. But I think in its simplest form, it's really kind of recalibrating our course towards some kind of strategic vision or North Star. So a lot of organizations have maybe a 3 or 5 year strategy, 3 to 5 year strategy. Maybe they have a North Star that they're working towards. Periodically, organizations want to pause and kind of determine, are we on path? Are we on the course to that achieving that strategic vision? So, in its simplest forms, that's what it is. I tend to think annual planning consists of kind of two elements. One is the reflection part. So let's look back and kind of let's assess the progress we've made in the past 12 months. What are some of the challenges that we've come across that we want to learn from and maybe try to avoid in the coming years? And then what have we learned over the past 12 months? So we're learning a lot every day about our customers, about our business, about ourselves. So what are all those things? So the part of annual planning, I think, is the reflection part. And then the other part of annual planning, of course, is the look ahead part. So where do we want to be in the next 12 months? Do we stay on the course that we're on, or is it time to pivot in a different direction? What are some of the outcomes we want to achieve in the next 12 months? What are some of the ideas and initiatives that we have that we think will get us towards achieving those outcomes? And then how are we going to prioritize all the things we want to do? So no doubt there'll be more things we want to do than we have appetite and capacity for. So how are we going to prioritize those things? The end goal here with annual planning, I would argue, is to kind of resharpen the organization's focus for the next 12 months and to give everybody from at the senior most level down to the, folks that just walked in the door yesterday, give them a real clear picture of what we need to try to accomplish and where we're headed in the next 12 months. The last thing I'd say about annual planning is I believe it's a practice that scales across the organization. So you can do annual planning at the kind of the uppermost levels of the organization. You can do it at the product level. You can do it at the team level. So it's really kind of a good, healthy practice for not only the senior most executives to do, but for your teams and to do as well. So that's kind of how I view what annual planning is and what the purpose of annual planning is.
Great. Thanks, Jim. I really appreciate you setting the foundation for the conversation today. We'll go ahead and bring up the poll results that we just received too. And thank you all for recording your responses here. So it looks like this is pretty good timing for most of us to be having this conversation. Many on the call here are either in the midst of planning or haven't even started yet. So we'll likely see some of that forthcoming here in the next few weeks. There's others that are really, and based on kind of motivation here today, looks like, again, we're kind of in the thick of it, or this is really their first time. So again, I'm hoping that a lot of the discussion here today will be fruitful for those that are here. So Jim provided a really good foundation for us in terms of what is strategic planning and why do we spend so much time as an organization doing it. And I'd really like to talk a little bit more about the strategic initiatives and the alignment to the overall organizational vision. So how do you really ensure that your strategic initiatives align with the overall vision and goals of the organization? And Scott, I know you're working with some folks today and doing just that. So if you could lend some of your feedback here, that'd be great.
Yeah, I guess first off, does your organization have an actual vision and goals and the North Star? Because that's kind of the first thing is do they actually have those? And assuming that they have those, kind of the next part is that actually communicated down from senior leadership, like Jim was talking about, all the way down to the people who just walked in the door? Because I find a lot of times that, sometimes that might get lost in translation, or it might not make its way down. It might just be at the senior leadership level, and then it kind of might make it down to middle management, middle tier leadership, and then it just kind of dies there. So I'd say the biggest part, besides having the actual vision and goals and things like that, are making sure that that stuff gets communicated down all the way so that everybody's got that North Star to follow. Now, I would say too, people aren't just satisfied anymore with the what. They want to know the why too. So they want to know okay, why are these our vision? Why is this our vision? Why are these our goals? And then they can figure out the how on how to execute some of that stuff. But people aren't just satisfied anymore with okay, yeah, these are our goals. I'll just go do my marching orders and go do those things. They want to know the why behind a lot of those things. So I think that's really important too. And again, keeping that North Star kind of visible for everybody. But then after that, I think it's mapping the initiatives that you have to kind of the goals of the organization. So, I mean, OKRs, objective key results, is a good way of doing that. So this could be things like you set an objective like, hey, I want to become the market leader in this space, for instance, the space that you're in. And then you could have key results that are actually like measuring how you become the market leader in the space. So it could be like increasing new customers by like 20%, increasing sales by 30%, reduce customer onboarding from like a week to a day, whatever it is that makes sense for your company. So you kind of have the objective, that's kind of the North Star, and then kind of how we're going to go about measuring that, hey, we've achieved that objective. But then again, trickling down those initiatives, like Jim said, so that way everybody can kind of do their own planning at their own levels. But they really need that North Star to kind of figure out like, okay, where are we going? So like, do we need to reanalyze how we're doing our workflows, like identify bottlenecks, whatever the actual tactical things are to achieve those goals, I think is pretty key, as well as reevaluation. So I feel like something I've seen consistently is like, okay, around strategic planning time, like, okay, we set these goals out for the year. These are the things we're going to do. And then that's like everybody rallies behind that for the first like 3-ish months. And then people start to lose track of those things as you go further down. So like you get 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 months in, and it's like, okay, are we still aligned around these things? Because people forget or priorities change. Like COVID kind of slapped us all in the face a few years ago and changed things up. So, do we need to reevaluate like, hey, are these still the right goals? And if so, we need to make sure like our initiatives are aligned to those things. So those are kind of the things I'd watch out for, especially the reevaluation phase, kind of, I'd say 3+ months after you kind of set kind of the goals for the year.
Yeah, I
Great.
think I would just jump in there. I really like one of Scott's earlier points there about really helping teams understand kind of their role in helping organizations achieve some kind of success. And maybe the other thing I'd add in there is I always like to ask the question of like, if we fast forward 12 months, like what's going to make us happy and feel good about ourselves? And so, it's one thing to say we want to, build this thing or deliver this thing or, do this, do that, whatever. But really at the end of 12 months, what's going to make us feel good? And that starts to get people to think about like outcomes so it's not so much the building of things, but it's like when we build those things, it's going to help us do this, right? Or it's going to allow us to do this, enable us to do this. So really good answers. I like what Scott said.
Great. And I really appreciate the distinction of kind of the deliverables versus the outcomes, right? That's something we've really been helping not only our internal teams with wrapping their mind around, because in many cases, it's something completely different than what we have been accustomed to in years past. It's very much, let's get something out the door, let's get it in the hands of our customers. But sometimes we lose sight of like, what's the impact that we're really trying to put forward with our customers that we serve. So I'm going to actually, take alignment a little bit further here, and we talked about the importance of it, but another part of that is ensuring that stakeholders are in the loop and bought in. So let's talk a bit about the stakeholder specifically. What's the overall process you'd recommend for identifying the stakeholders and gaining buy-in from them during the planning journey to maximize success? Jim, do you want to start with this, and maybe others can hop in if they've had some experience with just this as well?
Yeah, I'll get us started. I'm sure Mike and Scott can jump in here and add some good ideas as well. So, good news, bad news. I think when it comes to stakeholder engagement, it really is going to tap into your networking and relationship building skills. So, if those are skills that you have, those are things you like to do, that's a good thing. And if not, well, hey, this is an opportunity to practice and build those skills. So, and arguably, stakeholder engagement there's probably more art to it than there is science. One of the pieces of advice I would give you is early and often. So start talking with your stakeholders sooner than later. Kind of the key test there is if stakeholders are asking you what's going on or what's the status or like where are you at with this thing, it's probably a little bit too late. So you probably should be having conversations before those questions start to come your way. The other thing is really trying to help stakeholders or really kind of leaning into stakeholders to help you understand objectives and outcomes. So sometimes initiatives can be shiny objects. And so what are those shiny objects, again, going to enable in terms of outcomes and objectives? The last thing I would tell you with piece of advice before I give it over to Mike and Scott is trying to understand when you're talking to stakeholders who has voice. Everybody has voice, right? But who has the power of veto? And really understanding like who in your organization can kind of put the kibosh on things. So everybody wants to have a voice. Everybody should have a voice. And so, no, I think a lot of folks feel like they've got an opinion to lend, which is great. We want those opinions. We want those ideas. But really, as you're talking with stakeholders and kind of understanding what their role is and how much influence they have over things, trying to understand, do they have the power of veto? And that's really important distinction to make. Mike or
Jim,
Scott?
I'm gonna stay on this for one more moment because we did
Yeah.
have somebody provide a question in advance of the session. I think speaking to those that all want to have a voice and opinion, and oftentimes it's the executives that tend to want to maybe veto or make sure that their initiative gets greenlit. So do you have any advice, again, you or others here, about how to keep those participants involved in the process without taking over, especially the C-level employees?
Yeah.
I know you had kind of said over communication, but any other
Yeah.
tips and tricks there
Yeah,
that
maybe one
useful?
thing I would add there, I think one-on-one conversations, at least initially with a lot of your stakeholders, I would favor those as opposed to like group stakeholder meetings right off the bat. Because we've all been in meetings before where you've got like a C-level person in your meeting, and the C-level person offers their opinion. And guess what? Everybody's like, yeah, that's, I should probably say I agree with that, right? Because that person is a C-level person and she knows, she has great influence here in the organization. So, I think one of the things I would suggest, in addition to kind of early and often, is one-on-one over group stuff to start with, kind of a group approach. Mike or Scott, what would you guys add to that?
I mean, I think you kind of touched on it a little bit with just like, yeah, identifying like stakeholders of like how uh, involved they need to be, and like do they actually care about that? Do you need to keep them close? Do you just kind of need to inform them every once in a while? Do
Yeah.
you all of those kinds of things? And yeah, identifying what their influence level is, and I like the veto uh, the veto litmus
Yeah.
test, I guess, of
Yeah.
trying to figure out like, hey, how much influence does this person actually have? Because if they
Right.
can't veto it, maybe they don't have as much influence as you might think. So
Yeah, and it may not always be evident just by the role too, right? The role and title doesn't always necessarily
100%.
clarify like who has veto power. So it's going to require some conversations and kind of some deeper exploration of the folks and then their influence over the initiatives.
All right, well, thank you. I'm going to get Mike here to talk a little bit more about something that is really going to, I think, assure progress towards the planning that you've done and spent a lot of energy towards, right? And that's measurement, right? So let's dive into that. And Mike, if you could share a little bit about some metrics that you prioritize to measure the success of your strategic initiative, I think that would be really helpful for the audience here today as well.
Sure. So I think at the highest level, that 5,000 foot view, one of the things that we want to do with metrics and measuring our success, right? Are we on time? Are we on budget? And we can put those in and classify them a couple different ways. So on budget's pretty straightforward. We have so many dollars or whatever to complete an initiative, and what is our burn rate, right? The time can be looked at in two different ways, right? So if we have let's say 1,000 hours allocated to an initiative or a project, where are we at in that 1,000 hours? Or we could turn around and say, are we on time? We wanted to complete this by the end of Q1. Q1 is now over? Did we do it? I'm big into metrics, right? And there's a phrase that says what gets measured gets managed, what gets managed gets completed. And so even the simplest things like time cards, right? How many hours are being put in there? you can really drill down. One of the things that I've done is drill down and almost paralysis by analysis, but allocation, right? So you have somebody that works on your team that's doing some engineering, they might be doing some support, they might be doing some other things. Where's their time being spent? And even though they might be salaried, that doesn't mean they can't submit a time card, just so that you can measure. I've often said that I've had full-time employees, when I say, listen, we're going to do time tracking, they're like, I'm salaried, I'm not hourly. And I go, right, I'm not looking to micromanage your time. But if I see consistently that you're putting in 60 hours a week, that's a problem. If I see consistently that you're putting in 30 hours a week, that's a problem. But if we don't have those time cards, if we don't measure things, then we really have nothing to base our findings or our thing on. To go to a C-level and say, yeah, we're doing good. Well, how? Why? What is good? How do we measure that? And again, you can get really granular, but I think at the 5,000-foot view minimum, you need to know where you're at, time, budget, those sorts of things.
Great. And I know that coming from, a background in engineering too, it's often easier to measure deliverables, right? How many features are we getting out of the door? What's our velocity? Things of that sort. When you start talking about these higher level initiatives and sometimes often more broad, I know, Scott, you kind of alluded to the key results and some of the measures that you can put there. Any ideas around some of those like impact measurements too that could potentially be fruitful for, as Mike was pointing out, the C-level that we're green is probably not enough for them to be satisfied with the status?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think going back to like before you even kick off something, like what is the point of doing it? Because there's also the like aspect of like, okay, we're on time, on budget, did the scope that you asked for, and then it's like, okay, on to the next one. And then it's like, okay, did we actually like move the needle? And some of those conversations need to happen more upfront of like, okay, why are we doing the things that we're doing? Oh, we want to see sales increase. That's like the simplest thing. Okay, like can we measure that sales increase? Like do we have the ability to query our systems to know, did sales increase? Hopefully that one you do. But there's other things like, we're trying to drive engagement to our platforms. Okay, what can we measure that engagement actually happen, and some of those kinds of things. Some of that stuff you hopefully are kind of getting some of that stuff out up front. But sometimes it's like, yeah, you're on time, on budget, within scope, but then you didn't actually measure that you made an impact at all. It's just like, oh, we checked off that feature, and then at the end of the year, I've seen like, hey, we did this feature, we did that feature, we did this, we did that. Like we did complete all these initiatives, and it's like, okay, what was the impact of that? And everybody kind of looks around the room and is like, we did the things that our customers wanted. It's like, well, did they actually want those? Like, how do you know that they wanted those? Was it just like one person who said that, or was everybody asking for that? Did that make their life better or worse? So yeah, some of those kinds of things. I mean, there's like Net Promoter Score, NPS scores that you can see like, hey, do your customers enjoy using your product? And I know there's also like some takeaway questions you can ask too that are like, how disappointed would you be if this feature or this product left? And if people are like, I wouldn't be super disappointed, then that might be an indicator like, okay,
It's a great
maybe
one.
there's not a lot of value here. So it's not just like, did this add a lot of value, but like, what if I take this away? Which people inherently have a bias towards. Like if you say, hey, I'm going to flip a quarter, and if it's heads, you're going to give me $5, but if it's tails, I'm going to give you $6. A lot of people won't actually take that bet, even though it's technically like more profitable over the long term that you get $6, because people don't want to lose their $5. So there's also like that takeaway aspect can also be a good tool to use to try and draw out some of these things out of people too, and what the impact is.
I think that's kind of a good segue into our next section, which is around prioritization and making sure that everyone that you are working with is, getting what they need out of the work and objectives that you've outlined. But in some cases, being able to say no, which may mean that you're taking away one of their, prized possessions when it comes to a special project or an initiative they want to get across the finish line, right? So one of the questions that we received in advance of this session was to really understand how do we prioritize with limited resources? Scott, I'm just going to kind of pick on you here. How do you recommend prioritizing multiple initiatives with limited time, budget, and personnel?
Yeah, this is a tough one, and something I feel like probably everybody's feeling a little bit right now, where I feel like a lot of people are getting asked to do more with less, more so than other times. I think the consulting answer is it depends, but I'll try and say what it depends on to hopefully see if that helps people. But I mean, I think it kind of depends, like, how constrained are your resources? Like, are you literally just able to keep the lights on and nothing else? Or maybe like you can't even keep the lights on. That's obviously a really bad situation to be in, and might require some conversations of like how you're allocating people. So one thing I've seen be successful is doing like a people analyzer exercise to make sure that you have the right people in the right seats. So kind of that exercise is like, hey, you've got people in different roles. Like you might have somebody who's in a manager role. Well, like, do they actually want to be in that role, or do they want to be more of an individual contributor? So you can kind of go through an exercise where you can ask yourself 3 questions about different roles of, do they get it? Like, do they understand what the role is? Do they want to do it? Do they want to actually be in that role? And do they have the capacity to do so? Because sometimes when you are feeling resource constrained, you might have people, the right people in the wrong seats, or you might have the wrong people in the right seats too. So sometimes people might not be effective in the position that they're in. So you might have to shuffle people around or do some of those kinds of things. But assuming like, so that's one way to like create capacity if you're in that kind of situation. Now it's not going to be an overnight thing, but that's something like long term you can start to create some of that capacity. But assuming you have some capacity to do those things, then I think prioritization is pretty key, and just giving that like what's the impact of what we're doing. Again, I mean, you could do like a pretty easy like impact versus effort type of matrix of like, hey, what's obviously we want something that's like high impact but low effort. So if you don't really have a lot of people to work on something, you can obviously try and prioritize those high impact low effort things, and obviously avoid the low impact high effort items. And you don't have to get into the weeds of like, hey, this effort is 13.33 repeating days. You can just like t-shirt size things very easily, saying, hey, this is small, medium, large, and don't really get into the nitty gritty details of like, this is the exact amount of days that this will take, or hours even. But then, yeah, just identifying like what's urgent and not to, what's a need to have versus nice to have, some of those kinds of things. But also, I think sometimes when people are resource constrained, they don't always bring their leadership along for the ride. A lot of times they just like take it on the chin and are like, hey, I'm just going to put my head down, work through this. Me and my team are going to work through this. And they don't actually like make that visible. Instead, they're working 50, 60-hour weeks and hiding some of those things. And if you're doing that, you're probably hiding that you have a capacity problem. If you're having to work 50, 60-hour weeks in order to kind of keep up with your workload. So I think just making it visible to your leadership if you're in that resource constraint problem. They may know already, but try to show them your situation, make it visible, ask them for input and ideas too. Because again, I feel like too many people just kind of hide that stuff from leaders and whatnot. So
I'd probably add another arrow into that quiver. So of those ideas that Scott shared, which were all really good, I've also seen kind of a high leverage technique of using investment themes before. And so this is where an organization makes the decision. Again, this is probably a practice that can be scaled. You can use this practice at the organizational level. You can use it at the product level, but this is the practice of identifying how we're going to use our capacity over a given period of time. So whether it's a quarter or a year, so we're going to dedicate X percent of our capacity towards these kind of things, and X percent and Y percent towards these, and Z percent towards these kind of things. So that can be again a kind of an effective technique to kind of parse through this list of things, because typically the list, as Scott mentioned, the list is going to be well beyond your capacity in most cases. And so this is a way to kind of club things together and limit how much you spend on certain types of things.
Great. And it kind of
One
comes
of the-
back to what Mike was sharing as, measure those hours that are being input into those objectives, because that may really help in telling that story upwards or out to gain more momentum towards the effort. And Mike, I interrupted you there for a bit, so please chime in if you had something to add there.
No, that I was just going to add there. Thanks, Danielle. That if all things are equal, right? So you have 10, let's say 10 small initiatives, and then you have 2 large ones. And whether you get the 10 small ones done or the 2 large ones doesn't really matter, right? All things are equal. Go with the small ones. And I say that from a team and a leadership perspective. You're going to create you're going to have a smaller cycle and create more wins. And from a morale, a culture, the camaraderie perspective, you can celebrate 10 wins versus 2. I'll take the 10 all day long.
And I'm going to try to pull a little bit more out of that. Is that, to say like some of those bigger initiatives that you break down into smaller components to make those more successful? Or is it truly like looking at all the efforts we have here based on the size of that particular effort, we're going to go after that one just to get some wins under our belt, or both possibly?
I think it depends on the engagement or what the initiative is, right? Because if you turn around and say, well, I'm going to take this large engagement and break it up into 5 or 10 smaller chunks, is it really over? Or are you just kind of going through phases of it, right? Because now we finished phase 1, we celebrate, but guess what? Tomorrow we need to start phase 2. Sometimes just having that complete change of scenery is good. Now, there's some people that would just rather nose to the grindstone, stay in phase 1 and then move to phase 2 and phase 3. But generally, in my experience, people having something new and fresh and exciting to engage with tends to keep the team refreshed and excited and everything else.
Great. Thanks for your input there. I'm going to kind of bring the stakeholder management and prioritization together, because this was another question that was frequently asked, was really around the idea of managing expectations for those that have been rallied around the key priorities that you've identified. We've all already heard here today, there's often a lot of priorities, there's often a lot in WIP, and you can't satisfy everyone all at once. So any tips and tricks around how to say no? I know, at LT here, we often try to, again, communicate or over communicate in some cases and make visible what we have in the pipeline. I think Jim and Scott have both used the concept of now, next, later. So if you could maybe share a little bit about that, or any ways that you can maybe get to the no, or potentially help manage those expectations from all those you're supporting.
Yeah, I think one of the bigger things I had to learn, and there's people on this call who know I'm still not good at this, but I have tended to say yes to everything. I'm better about saying no to things, but I also have learned I don't have to say no. I can just say not yet. So I think that's the other thing, is like people tend to not want to say like no to people. And so like, oh yeah, we can do that. We'll throw it on the backlog. The team will start working on that. And suddenly the team has like 20 things in progress for I don't know, 8-person team or something like that. And, or, there's tons of initiatives across the whole enterprise that are going on. So I think just, saying not yet. And again, I'm still growing in this area. So is something that I've had to learn. But yeah, the now, next, later can be kind of a tool in that vein of like, okay, that might be in the later column. Like right now we're working on these, but I think the now, next, later, kind of prioritizing your work that way of like, okay, we're working on this now, we're going to work on these initiatives next, and then we're going to work on these later, helps bring like transparency to some of that stuff, because if people don't know what you're working on, like everybody wants their thing to be worked on, that they kind of like their thing that gives them the most impact. But I find when you give transparency, whether it's at a very detailed level or a very high level of, hey, we're working on these things and here's why, then people, it sparks conversations, because you might find out, oh yeah, that totally makes sense, because that's, you know, that's going to be a new product offering for us that has potential to be a big impact. We're expanding to a new country, whatever it is. So that totally makes sense that you guys are working on that in the now phase. But it also might spark conversations of, well, uh, you know, my thing that's currently in later actually has this potential impact, and that might surface some uh, previously unknown impact that something could have. And so like just being transparent with people, I think, is the key, versus if you're kind of keeping your cards to the vest and not telling people kind of what's being worked on. I found that's just not an effective way of working, I guess, long term, and usually breeds like resentment. And also people might like wonder what you're working on and their mind goes crazy and all that kind of stuff. So and then, yeah, I mean, we talked earlier about like identifying who the key players are in your organization. And I'm guessing one of them for everybody is the CEO of the company. But it's like, okay, who influences the CEO? Because there's people that the CEO listens to, or like, it doesn't have to be the CEO. It could be somebody else that you're trying to influence. But everybody has some sort of influence in the company. So just identifying who those influencers are, so that you can kind of bring them into the conversation and help them, like you guys help each other essentially achieve some of these initiatives.
Okay. Maybe soften some of the not yet conversation if you need to, if you get the right people involved in those discussions.
Correct.
Thanks.
Yep.
Well, we're going to move on to talk about impact. And I think that word has been used quite a bit here, right? And what value are we bringing ultimately, and what outcome are we hoping to achieve? And that's something that we talk a lot about with our clients. And that really, the work you're doing is the highest value and the highest impact work possible for the organization as a whole. So I want to dive into this a bit. First, though, we're going to do our next poll question, and I'd like to get some input from the attendees here with a quick poll. So that'll pop up here shortly, and then we'll get going. So the first question that I have in regards to this is, how does IT get something on the organization's overall strategic initiative list? Jim, I think you have some experience with this, so if you could maybe take a first cut at that, that would be great.
Yeah. So, earlier I mentioned the skills of networking and relationship building being really important when it comes to stakeholder engagement. I think to influence the adoption of IT initiatives and get the IT initiatives incorporated into the overall initiatives of the organization takes negotiation, and so that's a really important skill to have or to work on with respect to this. In my own personal experience, I've found success in making sure that stakeholders can understand and you can translate the value of IT initiatives. So IT initiatives can tend to be very technical in nature, and sometimes it's a challenge for folks outside the organization to understand like what that thing really is, or like why should I want that thing, or why should I support it, or why should we give that thing priority. So I think helping your stakeholders kind of make the connection between the thing that we want to do, the IT or technology initiative, and how that helps enable business outcomes. So does that make us faster? Does that generate revenue? Does that reduce our expenses? So anytime that you can put IT initiatives in terms of dollars and cents, that's really going to help your cause. And that's going to give you a much stronger business case. And certainly your stakeholders understand dollars and cents. And then maybe the last thing I would try to encourage you to think about is, at least here at LT, we talk about technology as a competitive advantage. So how are these things going to enable your organization to be more competitive? And if you can put it in those terms, that can be a really powerful, influential way of influencing.
The one thing that you can't forget also is in everything, Jim, you mentioned is all excellent points. The things that you can't live without, right? So yes, this is going to help our business. This is going to increase revenue. This is going to reduce expenses. But now, well, what is the impact if we don't patch our security?
Yeah.
Are we going to be the next hacked Target or Home Depot or, some organization like that? I think that's almost an easier sell, right?
Hmm.
Because no CEO or C-level wants to sit there and say, you know what, IT came to me and said we need to upgrade our infrastructure from a security perspective, and we declined to do that. And now look what has happened to us. So that's the other aspect. The other side of the coin is what from priority, and that is what can't you live without?
Hmm.
I think we've definitely seen that with, there have been events across industries like security related events. And I think when one happens in the industry, that some of our clients are in, that's like a really easy, like, hey, it's an opportunity to say like, hey, we need to make this investment because see our competitor over there, they had this issue. And that's something I've noticed is like upgrading security, uh, doing security patching isn't like the flashiest thing in the world, but as soon as they see like their competitors had an issue, they're like, okay, we need to get on top of this. This can't be us, and all of that kind of stuff. So that's something also like you can kind of keep your eye out. And it doesn't have to be security patches, but like what's going on in your industry, and can you like leverage those events that have happened to tell your story, whatever that story is.
Great. It's really good to have this feedback, and it's even better to hear from the audience today that many of the folks here have a seat at the table and feel that they have been able to work with their executives to make sure that IT is really a priority for their organizations. So I think we're going to jump into how to operationalize all this work that you have put into a plan, right? And do you want to get one more pull out here quick to just kind of get the vantage point? So please go ahead and respond here, and then we'll get into execution and operationalizing what you're doing. So oftentimes the plan itself is a lot of work, and it looks great on paper, but it starts to collect dust once the planning cycle ends. So how do you reinforce the plan once it's actually built? I know, Scott, you've commented a little bit about this, but Mike, I'd be curious to hear if you have any tips on how do we make sure that we continue forward with what we've set out for our organizational goals?
Yeah. So I guess to kick this off, I think of annual planning or annual operation planning almost as an oxymoron, right? Because you have planning, and to me, a plan is something that is ever evolving. It's a living, breathing thing that changes ongoing. But when we put annual in front of there, we're saying, well, we do this once a year and then we set it and forget it, like the old Ronco. It needs to be a living, breathing thing. And so you create your plan, and that's great for the foundation or the starting point, the baseline, if you will. But then it has to be continuously looked at and evaluated. As I mentioned at the beginning, my career has been quite long, and we did everything waterfall, right? So we started, and what I think every industry and almost every department has learned is, you know what, agile and doing things in smaller little bits and iterations is really the way to go, right? So in the agile world, we have sprints. They may be 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever they are, but they're short cycles. Annual planning can't be, we can't run our business in short little sprints and cycles, but then turn around from the planning perspective and say, well, this is for the whole year. It doesn't work. So however you want to do it within your organization, but review that plan and adapt to it, right? If I'm a salesperson and my annual quota is $1 million, and I land a $900,000 client in January, it doesn't mean that my year is over. I'm $100,000 away from quota. We're going to adapt and overcome and adjust, right? And so we need to do that ongoing. What your cadence is really up to the organization, whether you want to do it every 2 weeks, you want to do it once a month, but you need to turn around and let's bring that plan back up. Where are we at? What have we accomplished? What's ahead of schedule? What's behind schedule? What's ahead of budget? What's behind budget? And then, okay, now how do we get there? How do we get there now, We can't change what we've done over the last month, 3 months, quarter, whatever it may be. But now let's reevaluate and adjust our plan ongoing. So I like to take the word annual, and that's a formality, but it can't be an annual process.
Right. Yeah, I think everyone has fallen a bit of a victim to losing sight of the plan during the year. So great to reinforce, like, we need to continue to look at it and review at some frequency. Any other tips or tricks that we could add here to less being putting the document in front of the team members that anyone could add that could be helpful to assure that we're staying on track or potentially adjusting accordingly?
Yeah, I agree with all the things that Mike said. I think a plan is good until you start the execution, and then as soon as you start, you learn something or something changes, and that is going to change your plan. So, I think the other thing I'd add to what Mike said, and it was probably implied in his comments, but just making the plan visual. So always keeping the plan in front of folks, always visualizing kind of the progress that we're making towards that plan, so that remember when Scott was talking earlier about as leaders, we need to help our teams connect to those plans, giving leaders talking points so that they can continue to talk to their teams about where they are on the progress towards that plan.
Great. Thank you. I think this is a question that's going to be pretty timely for the environment that we're in today. And something we're hearing across all of our organizations is just how much WIP everyone has, which can be really defeating and paralyzing. Yet many organizations are struggling with the weight of market uncertainty and budget cuts and layoffs. And I think we've heard this a lot do more with less, right? So it can be challenging to both say no and to also continue hitting your goals that you've set out as an organization. Any tips on how to navigate that, Jim? Any thoughts to share here?
Yeah, talking about WIP is probably a talk into itself. But one of the outputs of annual planning is this list of initiatives. And I think the tempting thing to do for organizations, or if the planning is at a product level, the tempting thing to do is want to start all those things at once. The fact of the matter is, work in progress is a productivity killer. And conventional wisdom would tell you that if you're working on two things, you're spending 50% of your time on two things. What research has actually showed us, if you're spending time on two things, you're only spending about 40% of your time on those tasks, and you're spending about 20% of your time context switching between the two tasks. So between context switching and this thing called attention residue, it's sucking a great deal of your priority. If you're working on three things at once, you're actually only spending about 30% of your time if you're only spending about 20% of your time on those three things, and you're spending about 40% of your time going back and forth amongst and across those things. So managing WIP requires a level of discipline at all levels of the organization. So not just at the topmost, and not just at the team level, but it requires a lot of discipline. There's also a lot of like tips and tricks that you can apply within your organization to kind of keep work in progress under control. So you can use things like WIP limits. We talked about now, next, later roadmaps. That's a way to kind of categorize your work and avoid starting all the work at one time. We talked about investment themes. We also talked about decomposing work. So the idea here is to create flow in your organization. The more WIP you have, the less flow that you tend to have in your organization. So kind of taking your large initiatives and decomposing those things into smaller ones allows you to create more flow and get more through the system. So those are just a couple quick tips that I would share.
Right.
I think too,
go ahead, Scott. Sorry.
No, you're good. Like, let's say you've got 5 things, and let's just say, for ease of math, everything takes a day. And even if there is no context switching costs, which there is, like Jim said, let's say you work on all 5 things throughout the day, throughout each day. So like you do 20% on each one. Well, you're not actually going to finish any of them until Friday. So like if you work on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, you're not going to finish any of them till Friday, and then you're going to bang out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, assuming you have no context switching costs. So you don't actually see the value of those 5 things that you're working on till Friday, versus if you just worked on one thing on Monday, then you're done with that thing on Monday, and now you see the value of the first item, and then same with Tuesday, Thursday, Wednesday, Thursday. So now you've got 4 things done by the time Friday comes, and you've potentially seen the value of that. And that's like, again, assuming you don't have any context switching costs with the first example. So, which the reality is you will. So that's not gonna, like all 5 of those things, if you're working on all 5 of them throughout the day, you're not going to see those on that Friday. You might see them on the following Friday or something like that. So I think that's the other thing, is when you're kind of trying to do a little bit over here, a little bit over there, you don't actually complete the thing as early as you could, and therefore you don't get the value out of the thing that you're working on.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Scott. And it's kind of lends itself to the next question I had, is really around, like, we all have our full-time day jobs, right? So like, not only are we doing all this to really push forward these larger objectives for our organization, but we are often doing firefighting and other operational demands that come up every day. So, not only the context switching, but just making sure that everything is taken care of throughout the day. Mike, I want to kind of close with you on this. Is there any ideas here that you have to balance all of that, if that's at all possible?
Oh, wow. Kind of caught me off guard there. As far as keeping things in balance, I think that it really comes down to almost like a less is more, right? So things that you have to get done, they need to, it comes back to the priority, right? But then to kind of incorporate what Scott and Jim said, your number one priority needs to be your number one priority, and probably should be really, that's the focus, rather than, well, let's take our top 5 priorities and start working them all out. Again, reiterating what Scott and Jim said about the context switching costs and your recognition and achievement. And again, as I said earlier, celebrating those little wins does a lot for morale on the softer, the people side of things. So prioritize, focus on number one most important part of the thing of the day, right? And not the top 5. From a leadership perspective, obviously you need to keep all 5 or 10 things in your preview, so you know where they're at. And a lot of times there's shifting that goes on. So what is number 3 priority may be tomorrow's number 1 priority, right? Right behind what was today's number 1 priority. But I think that's where we just kind of keep the team going and moving in that direction. All comes back to communication, right? Whether it's daily stand-ups or town halls or whatever, where you can keep everybody on the same page. The worst thing I hate seeing is 2 people working side by side. The left hand has no idea what the right hand's doing. And that can be through peers, right? 2 people work on the same time. That can be a leadership breakdown, or actually, if it was a leadership, it wouldn't be a breakdown. It was a management breakdown, because good leaders don't do that.
Yep. Well, Mike, even though I took you off guard, you did a really good job in wrapping
nice
up
job, Mike.
a lot of the things that we've already talked about here the last 50 minutes. So thank you for doing that and pointing out some of these significant elements that people need to incorporate into their annual planning and operationalizing all of that. So what we're going to go ahead and do is get to a close here. I appreciate all of the folks here on the panel and those that have attended, and for those that may see this virtually offline. So I appreciate all of your input here. The last few notes that I have here, we will be publishing the recording, and be sure to share that via email with all of you in the next day or so. And we want to be a resource for you. So if you think of any additional questions or can't remember a tip shared by someone here today, please be sure to reach out to us, and we'd love to help. We'll share our contact information in the follow-up email, or you can find us on LinkedIn or in the survey that will pop up at the end of the Zoom. So with that, thanks so much for joining us, and have a great day all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.